Everyone, ready to dive into AI risk. It's fascinating stuff, but honestly, a little unnerving too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We're looking at reports from NIST on managing AI risk. They're the National Institute of Standards and Technology, in case that wasn't ringing any bells. We've also got a cybersecurity guide from the SANS Institute. Don't worry, we've already sifted through all the tech jargon, so you don't have to. We'll break down the must-know info about those AI risks, how to think about them, and what questions to ask as AI, just becomes a bigger part of our lives.
It's not about being scared of AI, right? It's about getting a handle on it.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. So NIST created this framework for managing AI risk, and they call it, get this, the AI RMF,
Catchy.
right? AI Risk Management Framework.
Well, at least it's clear. And it's actually a really good thing they designed it to be adaptable. AI tech changes so quickly, the framework needs to keep up.
True. This field moves at like warp speed. Speaking of speed, NIST doesn't waste any time getting to the potential risks. They bring up privacy, obviously, and the possibility of bias baked right into the algorithms. And this one kind of blew my mind. They even talk about how AI could be misused to create, really harmful content.
It's a legitimate concern.
It is. It's easy to assume these systems are foolproof, that they just work perfectly in every situation, but that's not how it goes.
Yeah, people often think AI is just inherently more objective than humans or even traditional software, but that's not always the case.
Totally. It's like trusting your GPS even when it tells you to drive into a lake. Then there's this whole other thing, confabulation. Have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah.
What even is that?
So confabulation is basically when AI, especially the generative kind, presents totally false information, but, and this is the kicker, it presents it with total confidence.
See, that's what freaks me out a little.
Because we might end up believing it,
Yeah.
right? Imagine an AI assistant confidently telling you something that's just flat out wrong. It'd be like that friend who tells a tall tale with a straight face. But here, the implications could be a lot more serious.
It's not just a matter of AI getting a fact wrong. It's about the erosion of trust in information.
Exactly.
And NIST makes a really good point about how managing AI risk isn't just a tech industry problem. It concerns all of us,
100%.
Environmental groups, people setting policy, even everyday users, we've all got a stake in this.
Absolutely. Those different voices are essential. They help us grasp the potential impact of AI, set some boundaries, and make sure we're thinking about, civil liberties, fairness, those bigger issues.
For sure. And here's another thing most people don't consider, the environmental cost of all that computing power.
Oh, yeah. Training and running those complex AI models, it takes a lot of energy, which means a significant carbon footprint.
Makes you rethink all those free AI tools, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot a bit to the CISO guide from SANS. While NIST gives us the big picture, SANS gets down to the brass tacks of cybersecurity and AI. They talk about this scary-sounding thing called data poisoning.
Right.
So have you ever thought about how AI systems could be, tricked or manipulated?
Well, data poisoning is one way to do it. Basically, someone messes with the data used to train the AI, which can then lead to, skewed or even harmful results.
Oh, wow.
Think about an AI system that's supposed to screen loan applications. If it's been trained on bad data, that could result in some really unfair lending decisions.
Wow, that's a scary thought. How do we even protect against something like that?
Well, SANS is big on robust threat monitoring, and they stress the importance of understanding the vulnerabilities in AI systems, just like with any software, really.
Right.
But they also talk a lot about the human element, which is something we can sometimes overlook.
What do they mean by that, the human element?
It's not enough to just have the technical safeguards. We need a culture of security, a culture of critical thinking around the AI systems we're using.
We can't just blindly trust them.
Exactly. We need to be able to question the AI, understand its limitations, and be aware of how it could be misused, either intentionally or accidentally.
Being proactive, not just reactive. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so NIST actually gets into some very specific AI risks, particularly in their profile on generative AI. And one that caught my eye, not in a good way, is the possibility of AI being used to create, dangerous or violent content.
Right. It's a very real concern. NIST points out that with generative AI, this kind of content, Even recommendations for harmful actions could be created so much faster and on a much larger scale than ever before.
That's a sobering thought. And it's not just about like violent content. They even talk about AI generating disinformation and propaganda,
Yeah.
especially with deepfakes becoming more and more convincing.
Absolutely. And NIST argues that this could seriously erode public trust in legitimate sources of information, which can have a domino effect.
Right. Like, how do you even combat that? Okay, so we've talked about harmful content, but then there's the risk of data privacy
Which
violations.
is huge because to train these AI systems, you need tons of data. And sometimes that data includes personal information.
Right, like those free AI tools we talked about. And NIST points out that most model developers, they don't actually disclose the specific data they used for training. So we usually have no idea if our information was included or how it was collected.
Exactly. It's like imagine using an Ancestry AI service and then later finding out they sold your DNA data.
Ugh, not cool.
Not cool at all. It raises all sorts of questions about transparency and consent. People have a right to know what's happening with their data, especially when it's being used to train these powerful AI systems.
It's about control, right?
Absolutely.
And then there's the risk of data leakage. That sounds even more unsettling.
Yeah, it's a big concern. There have been studies showing that AI models, they can actually leak sensitive information about individuals.
What do you mean leak?
So even if that information was only present in a tiny fraction of the training data, the AI might still remember it and accidentally reveal it.
Like it over remembers.
Exactly. It's a major privacy concern.
It is. And speaking of remembering too much, it's almost like these AI systems are developing their own biases based on the data they're trained on.
Right, exactly.
It's a little creepy, actually.
It is, and NIST calls this harmful bias. And they're very clear that this is a big deal because it can actually reinforce and even amplify the biases that already exist in society.
Like how?
Think about an AI system used for, say, granting loans. If it's been trained on data where certain zip codes were historically disadvantaged, the AI might unconsciously learn to unfairly favor other zip codes, even if that wasn't the intention.
So it's not just about the AI being bad, it's about it reflecting the biases that are already present in the data.
Exactly. And this bias isn't just limited to, like, location data. It could be anything, gender, race, income level, anything that's reflected in the data the AI is trained on.
That's disturbing.
It is a complex issue and something we really need to address.
Absolutely. Okay, so NIST also uses this phrase, human AI configuration, which I had never heard before. What does that even mean?
It's basically about understanding and managing the ways humans and AI interact.
So how we act around AI and how AI, in turn, influences our decisions.
Precisely. And one risk that they highlight is automation bias, which is the tendency for us to rely too heavily on AI, even when we know it's wrong.
Oh, like when my GPS tells me to drive through a construction zone, but I do it anyway.
Exactly. And that can obviously have some pretty bad consequences, especially in situations where human judgment is essential.
Right. But then they also point out the opposite problem. When humans are overly skeptical of AI, even when it's giving good advice.
Yeah, that's algorithmic aversion. It's like refusing to take a shortcut your navigation app suggests, even if it's usually right.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, trusting AI when it makes sense, but also using our own judgment and critical thinking skills.
Exactly. Finding that balance is key. We can't blindly accept or reject AI. We've got to engage with it thoughtfully.
Makes sense. Now, this next risk factor from NIST really resonated with me, especially in today's world. The potential impact of AI on intellectual property.
Yeah, it's huge, especially with generative AI.
Right, because these systems, they're trained on massive data sets of existing stuff, books, art, music, you name it. So there's definitely a risk that their output could end up infringing on someone's copyright.
Absolutely. And that brings up all sorts of thorny legal questions about who owns the copyright to AI-generated content.
Right, it's like, is it the developer of the AI, the user who put in the prompt, or even the original creators of the stuff the AI learned from?
It's kind of a legal gray area right now.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. And of course, we can't forget the potential for AI to be used for, well, creating offensive or inappropriate content.
Right, and NIST specifically calls out the risk of AI being used to generate obscene, degrading, or abusive content, even deepfakes that put real people in compromising situations.
It's a disturbing thought, for sure.
It is. And while we can't prevent every misuse, NIST emphasizes the importance of putting safeguards in place to make it more difficult.
I mean, it's one thing to use AI to, like, write a funny poem or a catchy jingle, but it's a whole other thing if it's being used to create harmful or exploitative stuff.
Exactly. It all comes back to the idea that with great power comes great responsibility, and we have to be really thoughtful about how we're developing and using this technology.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, now this next concept from NIST, it's a mouthful. Value chain and component integration. What does that even mean in plain English?
It's about recognizing that AI systems don't exist in isolation. They're part of a bigger ecosystem that includes everything from the data they learn from to the hardware and software that makes them run.
So it's not just about the AI itself, it's about the whole system around it.
Exactly.
And if there's a problem in one part of that system, it can ripple out and impact the whole thing.
Exactly. That's why we need a more holistic approach to managing AI risk.
We can't just focus on one piece of the puzzle.
Right. And that includes considering the risks that might come with using third-party components, like pre-trained AI models or data sets.
Right, because if those components are flawed, it can compromise the whole system.
Precisely. It all connected.
I'm starting to see that. Now, this is a ton of information, and I'm sure some of our listeners are wondering, okay, but what can I do about all of this? What are the actionable takeaways?
The great thing is that NIST provides specific suggestions for managing all of these risks, and they break it down based on your role. So whether you're a developer or a policymaker or just someone who uses AI, there's guidance for you.
So they've got us covered from all angles.
They do. And it's not about waiting for someone else to fix this. No matter what your involvement is with AI, you can take steps to understand and manage the risks.
Okay, so NIST breaks their guidance down into 4 functions: govern, map, measure, and manage.
It's a good way to think about it, like the 4 pillars of responsible AI.
I like that. So let's start with govern. What's that all about?
At its core, govern is about setting the ground rules for AI, establishing some guardrails, if you will.
So are we talking about creating policies, procedures, guidelines, that sort of thing?
Exactly. It's about setting clear expectations and boundaries for everyone involved and figuring out who's responsible for making sure those rules are being followed.
Because someone needs to be accountable.
Right. And NIST is very specific about identifying the different AI actors and making it clear who's responsible for what.
So it's not just on the developers to get this right?
Not at all. It's a team effort. We're
Yeah.
talking developers for sure,
Right.
but also the people deploying the AI, the ones evaluating it, legal experts, and yes, even the end users. Everyone's got a part to play.
And everyone needs to be talking to each other.
100%. Communication and collaboration are key here.
It can't just be a bunch of separate departments doing their own thing.
Exactly. Everyone needs to be on the same page, working together.
Okay, so within govern, NIST gets pretty granular, breaking it down even further.
Oh yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive approach, which is a good thing.
Definitely. So what are some of the specifics they delve into?
Well, they emphasize understanding and, importantly, complying with any legal or regulatory requirements, which, let's be honest, can be a bit of a minefield.
Especially since the rules around AI seem to be changing all the time.
You're telling me. But NIST does offer some helpful advice on how to stay up to date and make sure you're in compliance.
Okay, that's reassuring. Now, what about building trust? How does that fit into this govern function?
It's fundamental, really. NIST talks about the importance of integrating trustworthy AI principles into an organization's policies right from the start.
What do they mean by trustworthy in this context?
They break it down into a few key characteristics: fairness, transparency, accountability, privacy, security, and robustness.
Those are some pretty solid qualities. It's like the recipe for a good AI citizen, right?
And NIST provides specific actions that organizations can take to promote these characteristics.
Yeah.
For instance, they talk about establishing clear policies around transparency,
Such as?
like documenting where the training data came from and its history, which is especially crucial with all the concerns around generative AI and deepfakes.
So you can trace the lineage of the content, see where it originated.
Exactly.
That's essential for combating misinformation.
It is.
And if you can't verify where something came from, how can you trust it?
You can't.
Exactly. They also talk about the need to evaluate the risk-relevant capabilities of AI systems both before and after they're used.
Yes, because the capabilities of AI are always evolving.
Right, so it's not a one-time check, it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. And our risk management strategies need to evolve along with the technology.
It's a bit of a cat and mouse game, I suppose.
That is.
But instead of trying to catch the AI, we're trying to stay one step ahead of the risks.
Precisely.
Now, One thing that really struck me was NIST's emphasis on establishing clear risk tolerance levels. What's that all about?
It's about deciding how much risk an organization is willing to accept when it comes to their AI. And obviously, this will vary depending on the organization and what they're using the AI for.
Right, a bank is going to have a different risk appetite than, say, a social media company.
Exactly. And NIST recommends considering a wide range of factors to figure out your risk tolerance, like what's the potential impact on the integrity of information? Could this be used maliciously? What are the psychological effects on humans?
Psychological effects. That's interesting.
Right, they're talking about the potential for AI to manipulate or deceive users, or the effects of interacting with AI that's designed to, mimic human behavior.
That's getting into some deep philosophical territory.
It is. But it's important. As AI becomes more sophisticated and more integrated into our lives, we have to think about these ethical considerations.
Absolutely. Another area NIST really emphasizes within govern is data security.
Oh, for sure. They talk about setting up strong policies and procedures to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all the data being used to train and operate these AI systems.
That makes sense. If the data is compromised, then the AI is compromised.
Exactly. And it's not just about preventing data breaches. It's about making sure that the AI systems are making decisions based on accurate and reliable data.
So, how do we ensure that?
Well, NIST recommends continuous monitoring and auditing to make sure those security measures are actually working.
So, it's not enough to just set it and forget it,
Nope, it's got to be an ongoing process of monitoring, evaluating, and making improvements.
constantly adapting.
Exactly.
Now, more and more organizations are relying on third-party AI resources like pre-trained models or cloud-based AI platforms. What does NIST have to say about managing those?
That's a great question because it's becoming increasingly common.
It is.
It's kind of like outsourcing your AI, which comes with a whole other set of things to consider.
Like what?
Well, first and foremost, you need to make sure that the third party you're working with, they've got strong security practices in place to protect your data. Because a data breach at their end is a data breach at your end too.
Right, it's like a chain, and you're only as strong as the weakest link.
Exactly.
And you'd want to be very careful about any agreements you make with these third-party providers.
Absolutely. You need to understand the terms of service, make sure you're not accidentally signing away any important rights, and that you're not giving them too much control over your AI systems.
Makes sense. Now, how do we make sure that we're not inheriting someone else's biases when we use these pre-trained models?
That is a really important point. You always have to consider the potential for bias in those models. They were trained on someone else's data, so they might reflect the biases present in that data.
So what can you do?
Well, you need to be aware of those potential biases and take steps to mitigate them.
That makes sense. And this actually leads us to another subcategory under govern, testing and evaluation.
Right before you even think about using an AI system, you've got to test it thoroughly, make sure it's working as intended, make sure it's not exhibiting any harmful biases.
You've got to put it through its paces.
Exactly. And NIST provides some really useful guidance on how to do that rigorously and fairly.
What about after the AI is up and running? Is that the end of the testing?
Oh, no, not at all. NIST is very clear about the importance of continuous monitoring and evaluation. You need to make sure the system is still performing as expected and that it's not causing any harm.
And if it is?
Then you need to be prepared to act. That might involve retraining the system, adjusting how it works, or even taking it offline completely.
It's about having a safety net.
Exactly.
Okay, so this governance function, it's really just the first step in NIST's AI risk management framework, right?
It is.
It's about laying the foundation for responsible AI development and use. But once you've got those governance structures in place, then you can move on to the next phase, which is map. But we'll dive into that after a quick break. And we're back, diving deeper into the world of AI risk with NIST's handy-dandy framework. Before the break, we were all about govern, setting those ground rules, you know? But now, let's jump into map. What's the deal with this stage?
So MAP is all about creating a blueprint, but not just any blueprint. Think of it as a detailed map of your AI system and everything around it.
Okay, so we're not just talking about the internal workings of the AI itself.
Nope, it's bigger than that.
Yeah.
You've got to understand how it fits into the real world, the potential risks and benefits, who's going to use it, and what impact it could have, not just on individuals, but on groups and even society as a whole.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it's a big task, for sure, which is why NIST breaks it down into these subcategories to guide you.
Makes sense. So where do we even start with something like this?
Well, one of the most crucial parts is figuring out the organizational context.
Okay, now in plain English, what does that actually mean?
It means understanding the organization's mission, what they stand for, their values, their risk appetite, and of course, any legal or regulatory stuff they have to comply with.
So it's about aligning the AI system with the organization's big picture goals, not just the tech specs.
Exactly. You don't want to develop an AI product that completely clashes with your company's core values, right?
Oh man, talk about a PR nightmare.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the organization figured out. What's next on our map checklist?
Next up, you got to characterize the AI system itself.
So time to get into the nitty-gritty of how it actually works.
Yeah, but it's also about knowing its limits, what it can and can't do. You need to document the tasks it's designed for, the techniques it uses, and importantly, what it's not designed to do.
It's like reading the instruction manual for your AI, knowing its strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And being honest about its potential for errors or, unintended consequences. Because no AI is perfect, right?
That's something good to keep in mind. No system is foolproof. NIST also mentioned something about scientific integrity and testing. How do those fit into this map stage?
Well, especially if you're talking about AI being used in really important areas like healthcare or finance, you've got to make sure the system is built on solid scientific principles, that it's been thoroughly tested, and that it actually works.
So it's not enough to just have a fancy algorithm. It needs to be backed by evidence.
100%. And that includes looking really closely at the data and the algorithms themselves for any potential bias that could skew the results.
Because you know what they say, garbage in, garbage out. If your data is biased, your AI is going to be biased.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Now, what about the deployment context? That sounds important.
It is. This is where you think about the environment where the AI is actually going to be used. Who are the users? What kind of data will it be interacting with? What other systems or processes is it connected to?
It's like scouting out the land before you send in your troops.
Exactly. By understanding the environment, you can anticipate potential problems and create safeguards.
Okay, so you're planning for those what-if scenarios.
Precisely.
And then the last thing NIST talks about in MAP is understanding the impact on individuals, groups, even society as a whole. That's a pretty broad scope.
It is. And it's probably the most crucial part of MAP. You need to really consider the potential consequences, both good and bad, of using that AI system.
So it's not just about does it work, it's about what happens if it does.
Exactly. AI has the potential to do amazing things,
Hmm.
but it can also cause harm if it's not developed and used responsibly.
It's a powerful tool that needs to be handled with care.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about govern, where we set the rules, and map, where we've, well, mapped out the AI landscape. What comes next?
The next phase is measure, and this is where things get a bit more concrete. We start putting some numbers to those risks we've identified.
Oh, okay, so we're moving from those qualitative assessments to quantitative ones.
Precisely.
But how do you measure something like, say, bias or fairness? Those seem like subjective qualities.
Yeah, it can be tricky, but NIST provides some really useful guidance on choosing the right metrics to measure different types of AI risks.
Okay, so give me an example. Let's say you're worried about bias in an AI system being used for, I don't know, hiring decisions. How would you measure that?
Well, you wouldn't just look at how accurate the system's recommendations are overall. You'd need to dig a little deeper.
Makes sense. What else would you look at?
You'd look at how it performs across different demographic groups, like gender or ethnicity, to make sure it's not unfairly favoring one group over another.
So the metrics have to be specific to the risk you're trying to measure.
Exactly. One size doesn't fit all in this
Right.
case. And even with all the data in the world, you can't forget about human judgment.
So don't just blindly follow the numbers.
Right. NIST is big on involving domain experts and stakeholders in the measurement process, getting their insights and perspectives.
Because sometimes those human eyes can spot things the algorithms might miss.
Exactly. Having a diverse team with different kinds of expertise, that's really valuable.
It's about having a more well-rounded view, right? Not just relying on the machines to tell us everything.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered govern, map, and now measure. We're getting through the list. What's the final stage in NIST's framework?
Right, so we've got govern, setting the stage, map, getting the lay of the land, and measure, putting some numbers on those risks.
Exactly.
But none of that really matters unless we actually do something about those risks.
Absolutely. And that's where manage comes in. It's the action phase of the framework.
So Less talking, more doing.
Precisely. It's about taking all the insights from those earlier stages, govern, map, measure, and putting them into practice.
Okay, so it's about moving from assessment to action. What does that actually look like? What are some of the key things we need to do in this manage phase?
Well, you can't tackle every single risk at once, right? So the first step is to prioritize. So figuring out which ones are the most urgent, which ones could have the biggest impact.
Exactly. You got to prioritize. And once you've got a handle on which risks are the most pressing, then you can start developing strategies to address them.
Okay, so how do we go about that?
Well, NIST talks about 4 basic strategies. You can try to minimize the risk, transfer to something else, avoid it altogether, or if it's a low-impact risk, you might just accept it.
So it's not always about eliminating the risk entirely. Sometimes it's about managing it.
Exactly. And the strategy you choose, well, it's going to depend on the specific risk you're dealing with. There's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Makes sense. Now, once you've implemented your strategies, you don't just want to assume they're working.
Of course not.
Yeah.
You need to monitor them, see what's working, what's not working. And if something's not working, you adjust, you adapt.
Right.
And throughout this whole process, documentation is key.
So you're keeping a record of what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the results are, that sort of thing?
Exactly. It's all about transparency and accountability. It helps prove you're complying with regulations and, it creates a record for others to learn from.
It's like taking notes for the next team that comes along.
Precisely.
Now, we've talked a lot about NIST's recommendations, which are super helpful, but we also have those SANS guidelines for CISOs. How do those fit into all of this?
Right. So the SANS Institute, they really zero in on the cybersecurity side of things, which is obviously crucial as AI becomes more integrated into things like critical infrastructure.
Right, we're talking about things like power grids, hospitals, financial systems. We need to make sure those are secure in this AI-driven world.
Absolutely. And the big takeaway from SANS is the importance of building a culture of security around AI. It's not just about having the latest and greatest firewall. It's about making sure everyone in the organization understands the potential risks and how to prevent them.
It's about being proactive, being aware, making smart choices.
Exactly. And SANS also stresses the importance of threat modeling, which basically means thinking like the bad guys.
Putting on your black hat, so to speak.
Exactly. You're trying to find the weaknesses in your system before someone else does.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Well, continuous monitoring is crucial because the landscape of threats, it's constantly evolving. You got to stay one step ahead.
It's like a game of chess, always anticipating the next move.
Precisely. And just like with NIST, SANS also highlights the importance of collaboration, getting everyone on the same page. The ISOs, the developers, the legal teams, the business leaders, everyone needs to be working together on this.
Because AI risk management, it's not a solo mission, right? It takes a village.
It really does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do we really want them to remember?
I think it boils down to this. In a world increasingly driven by AI, knowledge is power. Don't be afraid to ask questions, especially about how your data is being used, how these algorithms are made, what security measures are in place. These aren't just technical issues. They affect all of us.
It's about becoming informed and empowered users of this incredibly powerful technology.
Exactly. AI isn't some mysterious force. It's a tool created by humans, used by humans. And it's up to us to guide its development, to shape its impact on the world.
Well said. And on that note, here's something for our listeners to ponder. How is AI already present in your life? And how might those NIST and SANS recommendations, those principles of responsible AI, how might they inform your own interactions with this technology? Because the future of AI, it's not predetermined. It's something we're all creating every day with every choice we